Thanks, Toby. Well, folks, let me tell you about, another funeral that I remember very well. Here we go. Is it going to work, Jeremy? Okay, we'll put it on. About that's it. Excellent. About 12 years ago, my dear sweet mum contracted Alzheimer's. Everyone thinks their own mother is a saint. My mother really was a saint. I know why they call Alzheimer's the long goodbye now. So Mum had Alzheimer's for 7 years. It took her from being a sweet little lady to being a vegetable. She died in 2017. And so the funeral was at Grafton Lawn, or the Clarence Lawn Cemetery. So the picture, about 60 people, half of them signed up followers of Jesus, the other half really definitely not. Crowded around on a hot day in October. There's a grave there with the steel thing around it to lower the coffin. I'm one of the pallbearers. We pick up the coffin out of the hearse, we walk over and we put it on the straps that are across the grave, and then the minister, Mr. Hutton, who was a fair bit older than me, and from Scotland or Northern Ireland, that sort of accent, he gives a nod to the funeral director, and the funeral guy pushes a button, and the coffin goes out of sight slowly. Click, 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 click. And it just kept going for so long, like click, 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 to the point we're kind of looking at each other. And finally it stops. And it's about the same number as the people here. Everyone's close enough to actually kind of see into the grave. And Mr. Hutton, the minister, steps forward and he says, "I don't intend to say too much. I don't need to. You're staring at an open grave, and we'll all end up in there one day. And there's a judgment day. And if you don't believe it, it makes no difference. Now, Alan is going to say a few words." I've been introduced to speak at a lot of things, but now, like that is one you remember. So, what would you say? What can you say when really, the open grave, the coffin, people there, what can you say that isn't just like a bag full of cliches, like she'll be looking down on us or whatever it is? I memorised 3 sentences and spoke for a couple of minutes about those 3 sentences. What are the 3 sentences? Well, we'll get to that in just a moment. I'll show you. What can you say with an open grave there that is a real reason to hope, a genuine reason to hope? I mean, the 2018 Global Atheist Convention in Melbourne was called Reason for Hope, or Reason to Hope. Salman Rushdie was due to speak. The reason you can't remember it is it didn't happen. Why? Well, the organisers said, however, ticket sales have been substantially below expectations. Now, I can't help but wonder whether the people of Melbourne worked out that, with all due respect, if you push or take the atheist worldview to its logical conclusion, there is no reason to hope. I mean, Richard Dawkins, perhaps his most famous quote goes like this: "The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." There's not a lot of hope there. We're all going to die. We don't like to talk about it, but there are some people who don't have filters on that. My good friend George became a follower of Jesus later in life, 40-ish or something, and he just doesn't have a filter. He was telling me the other day, he was talking to a taxi driver about the fact that we'll all die. And so George says to the poor old cabbie, "Do you know what the mortality rate is in New South Wales?" And the cab driver said, "Oh, no." He said, 100%. And the cab driver said, "Oh, well, I knew it was high." Huh? We're all going to die. Now, if you're young and beautiful, like all of you, it's far away, it's academic. Yeah, we know, but it's a long time away. When you have a 6 in front of your age, you get reminded of it every morning when you get out of bed. We're all going to die. I remember asking one of my relatives, who's about 20 years older than me, so he was into his 80s, I said, look, you're getting older, near the last lap, you're going to die. Do you think about it much? And he said, well, my mother said it's inevitable, so don't bother thinking about it. I thought, well, I guess that's the way most people cope. You don't think about it. Certainly not polite to talk about it. And yet my mate George, without the filter, he says, no one's getting out of here alive. And sadly what it means is that not just that we'll die, but that every loving relationship ends in heartache. My mother and father-in-law, Kathy's parents, were married for 70 years. Now, Kathy's dad died in 2018, but Kathy's mum was 19 when she married and 89 when she was widowed. I mean, what a heartache to lose a partner after 70 years. And it's very hard, as I was saying earlier on, it's very hard to live without hope. It's what you believe about the future affects now hugely. Let me give you an example. One of the clearest examples I've seen of hope and the difference it makes. In 2010, in Chile, 5th of August, in the San Jose gold mine, there was a massive cave-in. They said it was like the whole mountain moved. And there were 33 miners trapped 600 metres underground. They were trapped in like a cavern. And eventually, after 69 days, they got them out. They got all 33 out. They drilled a large shaft and they dragged them out one at a time in like this torpedo tube. You can see it there. There's a kind of a close-up of it. They got them all out. But for 16 days, the miners sat in the dark and they did not know what would happen. 16 days, and nothing from the surface. After 16 days, they said half of them were thinking about suicide and the other half were thinking about cannibalism. Now, you can see how that could work, but we won't go there. Now, what happened? Well, on day 17, the rescuers on the surface managed to get a tiny shaft through and into that cavern, and light came in. Now, it wasn't a lot, but that little shaft kept them going for another 52 days. Why? Because they had hope. And then they all got to the surface and their wives and girlfriends were there and it was really happy for everybody, except one guy whose wife and girlfriend both turned up. So anyway, they all survived, even that guy. Why? Well, hope is what you believe about the future makes all the difference now. Now, the story we're about to look at, and Mike read the first half of it for us, the story we're about to look at is like a ray of hope that shines into our dying world. And what you believe about the future makes a difference now. So let's have a look. John's Gospel, chapter 11, if you've got a Bible, or it'll be on the screen. Now, John was Jesus' closest friend, closest disciple. He tells the story at the end of chapter 10. Jesus has actually had to leave the area of Jerusalem. Why? He's in debate with the religious leaders. Jesus is, how we put it, sailing very close to the wind of saying that he's actually God become a human being. And so the religious leaders are scandalised. They want to cancel him permanently. So Jesus then leaves town. Now, he goes to a place called Bethany. There's actually two places around Israel at the time called Bethany. There's Bethany where the event happens with Lazarus, which is a couple of k's from Jerusalem. There's another one called Bethany beyond the Jordan. So you can see on the eastern side of the Jordan. That's kind of the geography of the story. And Jesus has a little family, 2 sisters and a brother that he loves and cares for in Bethany, the one near Jerusalem. Let's pick up the story at verse 17. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, it's surprising that at the beginning of the story, we find that the two sisters send a message to Jesus saying, the one you love, Lazarus, is sick, and we're told because Jesus loved them, he waited 2 extra days. Because of that. Why? Because there was something that little family and us needed to see or hear about. All right. Now, you see the 4 days. In the first century, the scholars tell me that the rabbis of the time believed or taught that a person who died, their spirit was kind of around the body for 3 days. But by the time we got to day 4, the spirit was gone, there was no hope. The Bible doesn't teach that, but certainly that was the vibe of the first century. John is saying there was no hope. Right, so then we get to Bethany. Was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. Actually, you can go there today. I worked it out, it was 2.7 kilometres. The village today is known as Al-Elazariah, which means the place of Lazarus. Google it, have a look at it. Point being, this isn't Harry Potter or Mordor. This stuff happened in time and space. 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews who had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. We know from other stories, Mary was the get-up-and-go girl, Martha. Martha was the get-up-and-go girl, and Mary was a bit more kind of thoughtful, contemplative, etc. So Martha goes out to meet Jesus, and what does she say? Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. She's not accusing Jesus, but more saying, oh, if only. Right? If only you'd been here. Verse 23, Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And what does she mean? Well, as a first century Jewish woman, she believed the Old Testament, when the Old Testament said, one day at the end of time or the end of the age, everyone will be raised and people will be judged. Right? There'll be a resurrection of everyone. So the book of Daniel in the Old Testament says, multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life and others to shame and everlasting contempt. So Martha's assuming when Jesus says your brother will rise again, she's thinking, yep, sure, the end of time, the general resurrection. Martha's basically given up. In fact, she'll say in a little while, her brother even smells bad after 4 days now. It's too late. And then Jesus makes her a promise. Actually, he says 3 sentences, a promise and asks her a question. We'll come back to that in a moment. All right. So we see verse 28. After she said this is Martha, went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and he's asking for you. And when Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. She speaks with Jesus briefly, and then they come to the tomb where Lazarus is buried. And we're told, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Now that word there, the words deeply moved, are quite unusual. It's one of the few times it's hard to translate a word in the New Testament into English. Why? Well, the word, when it's used outside the New Testament, often it refers to a horse snorting. It's kind of, right, okay, whatever horse snorting sounds like. When it's used of people, it's used of, they said, anger or outrage. So it's like the idea of being really wound up and emotional and almost kind of angry. As Jesus comes to the funeral, he's kind of feeling cranky about something, or deeply moved. It's probably as close as they can get. What are we told then, the next verse? Where have you laid him, he asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Then verse 35, Jesus wept. Shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. Why? It's worth thinking about, isn't it? Why? I don't think it's for Lazarus, because Jesus knows in 5 minutes' time he's going to raise Lazarus. But I think he looks at Mary and Martha weeping and the others, and just, I I suspect it's just the pain and the suffering and the mess that our world's in. You know, I saw tears at a funeral on Friday. But you know, when I look at our world and the mess and the pain and this, I woke up an hour early this morning, like the body clock, okay, and I was sitting having breakfast, reading a news thing on an iPad, and Kathy came up and said, "You know, what are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I'm just reading, and the world is full of idiots." All right. Now I look at the pain and the mess and everything, and I just think, "What a bunch of idiots you are." Jesus looked at the pain and the mess, and he wept. He wept. Does he care? Yeah. You keep reading and you'll see him give his life to pay the price of forgiveness so it can be all fixed one day. In fact, those watching could see how much he cared. Verse 38, then the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of a blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, there's that stirred up word, deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there's a bad odour, for he has been there 4 days." You can see she's given up. In fact, the King James Bible, translated as Martha says, "By this time he stinketh." All right, so she knew. Verse 40, then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." Verse 43, when he said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Now, in the first century, the Jewish people didn't wrap you up like the complete mummy thing like the Egyptians did. They would wrap a dead body in cloths and put spices or sweet-smelling stuff there to try and keep the smell down. So he's kind of wrapped up and he's kind of walked out and with a cloth over his face. And I would love to have seen the faces of those who saw that happen. All right, two questions. First one's this, and the right question to ask, did this happen? And what is a little surprising is this is the only one of the 4 Gospels that tell this particular story. My guess is there was so much happened in 3 years with Jesus. Not everyone could record everything. And each of the Gospels come with a particular, how could you put it, angle or agenda to show things about Jesus. And this is perhaps such a big story that the other Gospels didn't have space to include it. As well as that, we don't know how many of the disciples, how many of the 12 were actually there. We know John was, and we know Thomas was. And Thomas, the little ray of sunshine, who said, "Well, let's go and die with him." Okay, we don't know how many of the others were actually there and saw it happen. But the New Testament, did this happen? The New Testament claims Lazarus is raised again, but Lazarus comes back to life, and then he will have died again. Okay, live for a few more years, etc., and then die like the rest of us. The much bigger question, and the one linked to it in a way, is the resurrection of Jesus himself. So the question is, did Jesus actually rise again? Because what the New Testament's claiming is not that Jesus kind of was resuscitated, but that Jesus rose again, that he'd conquered death, and he is the first one resurrected with a body that will never die, with a body fit for eternity. And he's the first one of the many who have followed Jesus who will be raised that way. So the question really is did Jesus rise? And if he really did, yeah, okay, he could do that with Lazarus. Now, how do you decide about that? Look, I know there's confirmation bias, okay, so, right. But I've read every alternative theory that I can find about explaining away the beginning of Christianity, alternative theories to Jesus rising, and I can't find one that holds water. Everyone I've read is much harder to believe than the fact that Jesus rose. Why? How do you kind of get it succinctly? Something transformed this group of first century Orthodox, strictly monotheistic Jewish men and women to believe that Jesus was God become man and had conquered death and risen. Something transformed. What? And not only that, Christianity begins very close in time and geography to the death of Jesus and then explodes across the ancient world. So much so, for example, that 30 years later, and 30 years, in world history is like 5 minutes, 30 years later, Nero can blame the Christians in Rome for the fire. That's how quickly Christianity spread. Well, what caused that? That change in the disciples, that explosion. How do you explain that? I've been talking to people about this for 40 years. Okay, the problem I've found is not people understanding or being impressed with the evidence. The problem is actually getting anyone who wants to look, because it's a scary thing to investigate, because it might end up like, say, what happened to Lee Strobel. Now, Lee Strobel's an American journalist. He was an atheist until the age of 29 when his wife became a Christian, and I think he decided to investigate it to actually prove her wrong. Now, he's written The Case for Easter, which is all about the resurrection. He's become a Christian from looking into the evidence. And if you'd like a look at the evidence, talk to Toby. Toby will set you up with all that, won't you, mate? He will, yeah. And it's not that hard to look, but beware what you might find. Okay, first question, did this happen? Second question, how do we understand this event? Okay. In John's Gospel, what we might call miracles they're not called miracles, they're called signs. And how does a sign work? Well, a sign points, the sign's there, but it points to something that's bigger and more important. And so Jesus does these miracles or signs, and that they say something about him. I'll give you an example. He feeds a crowd of 5,000 people with a few loaves of bread, and then he says, I am the bread of life. Or he opens the eyes of a man born blind, and then he'll say, I am the light of the world. Well, what happens here? He raises Lazarus from the dead, and he says, I am the resurrection. Now, what are the three sentences? If you go back to Grafton Lawn Cemetery and my mum's funeral, what am I going to say? Well, I just memorised 3 sentences that Jesus says and then talked about it for 2 minutes. Here's the 3 sentences, okay? He said to her, this is to Martha as he arrives, he said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? There's so much in those 3 sentences. Let me just pull them apart with you, okay? Remember, Martha believed in a resurrection at the end of time and a judgment day that the Old Testament promises. Jesus saying, yes, there will be a resurrection. People will be judged for how they've responded to God. Some will be taken to be with God forever, others sent from his presence to a hopeless eternity. But Jesus saying, it's all about him. He's the one who will raise people. He's the one who will be the judge. It's all about him. I am the resurrection, he'll say. Now, then he goes on. You see those 2 sentences that kind of say different things, even though he dies and then never die. Let me show you what he's saying. He's talking physically, then spiritually. Physical, then spiritual. So he says, he who believes in me will live even though he dies. Now, what does he mean? And belief and trust are the same word. If you'll trust him, you'll die, okay, but one day you'll live again. Yes, you will die physically, but one day you'll be raised again. Die physically, but yes, you will be raised, you will be resurrected. And then he talks spiritually. He says, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. What does he mean? It means spiritually. See, we think about death as the end. Okay, you die, bang, that's it. No, it's not the way the Bible thinks. The Bible thinks of death as separation. So when you die you die physically. It's the idea of your spirit being separated from your body. Okay? What's Jesus saying? If you'll trust him, you'll never die spiritually. You'll always be with him. You'll live on spiritually, and one day you'll be raised again. That's his promise. You see how those two work together? Okay, I'm going to ask again, and if a few more of you nod, I'll keep going, otherwise I'm going to have to go back and do it again. Do you see how those two fit together? Ah, good. Okay, excellent. Excellent. All right, and then he asked the question, do you believe this? Do you believe this? Now, like I said, in the New Testament, belief or trust, exactly the same word. Will you trust him in how you live? Why would you? Should you? Well, he's the one with compassion. He's the one who weeps over our world. And then he's the one who will give his life to pay the price of forgiveness. He's also the one with the power to raise Lazarus and see himself raised. Now, obviously, seeing a miracle would be enough, wouldn't it? Except, no, if you keep reading, I don't want to spoil it for you, but if you keep reading chapter 11, there are some of the Jewish people who see Jesus do this and they believe, trust him, but there's others who see this and then they go and tell his enemies who plan to kill him. They see Lazarus raised and then they still won't believe. In fact, the Jewish leaders, they know Lazarus has been raised and they plan to kill him as well. So it's not a matter of seeing miracles, it's a matter of the heart before God. Now, my guess is lots of us do want to follow Jesus, but you may be like me, you kind of wonder, do I really believe? Do I believe enough? Sometimes the faith level seems like 90%, other times it feels like 51%. What do I actually believe? Jordan Peterson, who's kind of all over the internet, etc., has some wisdom on this, psychologist. He says this, you can only find out what you actually believe rather than what you think you believe by watching how you act. Isn't that interesting? What do you believe? Well, you look at how you act, you'll see what you actually believe. It applies to most things in life, but it applies to actually what you trust spiritually or who you trust spiritually as well. All right, now as I look out here, you can see you guys are all young and beautiful, okay? And, or mostly young and beautiful, all right? Young and beautiful. And you're probably thinking, yeah, well, Al would get more traction talking about this in a nursing home when everyone's kind of on the last lap. But for most of us, well, this is a long way away, that's never going to happen. Well, maybe you'd get more traction in a nursing home. But I tell you, one of the ironies, it's not just your arteries that get harder as you get older. It can well be your heart as well. But I do have to admit, if you're going to give a talk about death, having an open grave beside you is, that helps with the traction. We couldn't organise it today, could we? No. Look, let me just say something to the young and the beautiful. This isn't just, hey, when you die, it'll be handy to have this for a life preserver. This is hope of the future, in the future, that makes a massive difference now. How? Do you notice what Jesus is talking about? He's not just saying, don't be afraid of dying. He's saying, I am the resurrection. And what the New Testament promises, what Jesus promised again and again is this, a resurrection, yes, but to be part of a new creation. And literally the Bible at the end says, a new creation where there'll be no more mourning or crying or pain, and God will wipe every tear from their eyes. And if you have little kids or nieces or nephews or whatever, just how close and gentle you have to be to wipe tears from someone's eyes. And so that's the promise. Right? It's hope in the future, yes, but it means as you deal with loneliness or anxiety or heartache or relationships that break or whatever kind of difficulty or sick or worry and even the young and the beautiful have heartache. It's that hope that makes all the difference. And sometimes it can feel like not a lot. The promise to hang on to what Jesus says, that promise can feel like not a lot. But I can't help but think about those 33 Chilean miners sitting in the dark And then that little ray of light comes through. Maybe it didn't seem like a lot, and it kept them going another 55 days. It's hope in the future makes all the difference now. I'm going to say a prayer. You might like to say amen. Our Father, thank you for this promise by Jesus that those who trust him will live, even though they die. And those who live and trust him will never die. Thank you that Jesus' own resurrection proves he can keep this promise. May we all come to trust him and so live with hope and confidence and joy. Amen.